Good morning from New York, good afternoon, good evening to those of you who are joining us online from elsewhere around the world. We're running a little bit late because we're expecting a few more people to arrive, but we'll make a start, do some introductions, tell you a little bit about the format of the event, and then hand over to our panelists. So I would like to really warmly welcome you to this 5th UN-UCPR Migration Policy Roundtable, which focuses on how we ensure gender responsive migration governance. My name is Heaven Crawley. I'm Head of Equitable Development and Migration at the UN University Centre for Policy Research. And the UN-UCPR is the UN's think tank here in New York. And I'm also Director of the Migration for Development and Equality Hub, MIDEQ, which together with UN Women is partnering with us for this event. So a few words of introduction about the aims and the format of the event. We know that gender affects all migrants at all stages of migration, but that it often has particular implications for migrant women and girls, as well as for marginalized groups such as LGBTIQ+ persons. We know, for example, that gender can be a driver of migration, and that deeply entrenched gender inequalities, which manifest in gender-specific forms of discrimination, for example, in terms of access to education, decent work, social protection, as well as social and sexual and gender-based violence, are major drivers of migration. My own research, which goes back to the mid-1990s, specifically explores how gender shapes the experiences of refugees who are seeking protection under the 51 Refugee Convention. Secondly, we know that gender can and often does shape the experiences of those who move. For many women, as for all migrants, migration can be a very positive experience, leading to better life and enhancing their livelihood opportunity, autonomy and empowerment. But migration can also expose women and girls to very serious violations of their human rights. Those who are on the move in terms of the experiences on those journeys, but also the kinds of multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination that migrants can face in countries of destination, where labour markets are often highly segregated and women often have limited access to information and lack decision-making power and control over resources. So that's really the context within which this roundtable is taking place. The international community, as you'll know, recognises increasingly the importance of not just gender sensitivity in migration governance, but gender responsiveness, actually translating that sensitivity into something that makes a difference. And the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration recognises the different forms that that gender responsive migration governance might take place. For example, taking account of gender at all levels of governance and all stages of migration, responding to the different realities of migrants by promoting and protecting their human rights at all stages in migration, ensuring that laws, policies, programs and services recognize and address the specific needs, challenges and situations facing migrants as a result of intersectional inequalities, and the need, of course, to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. So this aim of this event, and thanks again to UN Women for co-hosting with us, is really to bring together UN agencies, governments, academics, international organizations and civil society with the aim of sharing good practice as well as resources on and guidance on how we can mainstream, if you like, a gender perspective in migration governance with a focus on the implementation of the GCM. So I'd really like our speakers, and we've got some excellent speakers with us today, to tell us how they think data and evidence can support gender responsive migration governments, what specific actions government, international organizations and others, including civil society, can take to ensure that migration governance is gender responsive, how partnerships can be fostered and strengthened to enhance the delivery of gender responsive migration governance, and really what needs to be done ultimately to ensure that the GCM contributes to the realizations of the SDGs, and of course, in particular, SDG 5 on gender equality. And after the event, we'll do as we always do, we'll produce a UN-UCPR policy brief summarizing some of the key themes, and we'll circulate that to all of you once it's published. So just a few words about the format of the event. As I already mentioned, this event is organized in partnership with UN Women, for whom the issues of gender responsive migration governance have been a significant theme for at least the last two decades, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. The event is also organized in partnership with the MIDEQ Hub, as I mentioned, which is one of the world's largest migration research projects, focusing specifically on the relationships between migration, development, and equality in the countries of the Global South. And gender is one of the themes of MIDEQ, with a particular focus on intersectional inequalities associated with gender. And we're very pleased to have two of our MIDEQ researchers from Ghana and Nepal here with us today. So we're going to start with an opening presentation from UN Women. They'll be followed by a video message from Felipe González Morales, UN Special Rapporteur for the Human Rights of Migrants, who's unfortunately unable to join us today, but is very keen to share his thoughts on the issue of gender-responsive migration governance. And that will be followed by interventions from our three panelists, each of whom I'll introduce in turn before they speak. Once the presentations are concluded, we have an opportunity for some discussion. You're welcome in the room to just wave at me and I can take your questions and comments, or if you're joining us online, please type your comments or questions in the Q&A box. Keep the interventions brief just to enable as many people to participate as possible. And we'll conclude with some final remarks. I'll come back to the speakers and just see really what the takeaway message is from this in terms of how we can move forward. There has been a lot of talk about gender sensitivity and gender responsiveness. What we're really interested in doing is understanding how to translate that into reality and practice. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Simi Koyam from UN Women. Simi is UN Women's Policy Advisor on Sustainable Development, and her areas of interest within the broad domain of gender equality and sustainable development are the articulation of sustainable livelihoods, access to energy and resources, social and ecological resilience, and the continuum from unpaid care to decent work. Simi, we're really very happy to have you with us, very grateful for your time. You have around 15 minutes to make your intervention, and the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heaven, and thanks very much indeed to the United Nations University Center for Policy Research for co-organizing and co-hosting this critical roundtable. This morning, I'll focus on two broad themes. First, what is meant by gender-responsive migration governance and its importance, and second, supporting gender-responsive migration governance in practice, with a focus on UN Women's Policies and Practice Guide to Gender-Responsive Implementation of the Global Compact on Migration. To begin, what is gender-responsive migration governance? Why is it important? We could say that every aspect of migration is influenced by a person's gender, from the reasons for migrating, the information received before leaving, and the journeys embarked upon, to integration in countries of destination and return, the work performed, access to services and the lack thereof, and the discrimination faced throughout. Yet international migration governance has been largely gender blind. What does that mean? It reproduces or reinforces existing gender, race, and other inequalities, exposes women and girls and LGBTIQ+ people to greater risks of discrimination and human rights violations in journeys marked by high levels of gender-based violence, trafficking in persons, kidnapping, extortion, and forced disappearance. Not to mention the challenges in accessing decent work and basic services such as healthcare and adequate housing. As we all know and believe, addressing these issues is a human rights imperative. Designing and implementing migration governance that is human rights-based and gender responsive means ensuring that migrants have more access to safe and regular migration channels and reducing the need to use dangerous, irregular migration channels. This is a crucial step to uphold human rights protections and prevent further discrimination. To do so requires concerted efforts from governments as well as the United Nations system and civil society partners. First, this requires the collection and more crucially, the analysis of disaggregated data and gender statistics to shine a light on the realities of migration and the pervasiveness of gender inequalities in migration. In turn, this data can be used to help strengthen gender-responsive migration governance in laws, policies, programs, and services, by firmly integrating a gender perspective. Only by so doing can migration governance effectively address the different experiences, needs, and situations of vulnerability of all migrants while upholding human rights, promoting the empowerment of women and girls, and advancing gender equality. To illustrate how this looks in practice, I would like to share one brief example from our Making Migration Safe for Women project, supported by the government of Germany. UN Women and the National Institute of Statistics of Niger recently concluded a study of the situations of women migrating from, to, and through Niger, as well as those returning to the country. Over 1,200 women were interviewed in 3 different regions of Niger to collect detailed information on their experiences at all stages of migration. This information gives us insight into the ways in which migrant women access information, the availability of services at different stages of migration, the use of smugglers, among other issues. We hope that this research and data will be used to inform policymaking and support the design of more effective gender-responsive migration programs. I'd like to turn now to supporting gender-responsive migration governance in practice. UN Women is committed to supporting member states in gender-responsive implementation of the Global Compact for Migration, GCM, which since its adoption by the General Assembly in 2018 has been our global blueprint for migration. The GCM underscores the importance of taking a comprehensive, multi-stakeholder approach to migration, highlighting the importance of a whole of society and whole of government framework, and centering human rights-based, child-sensitive, and gender-responsive principles. It's in this context that UN Women developed the online tool Policies and Practice Guide to Gender-Responsive Implementation of the Global Compact for Migration. Launched jointly with the UN Network on Migration during a high-level event in 2021, the Policies and Practice Guide is designed for policymakers and practitioners. Building on the gender-responsive approach outlined in the guiding principles of the GCM, this guide prioritizes the specific needs, challenges, and situations of vulnerability of women, girls, and gender-diverse people, and recognizes their heightened risks of human rights violations and gender-based discrimination, while highlighting their positive contributions in countries of origin, transit, and destination. So by unpacking the gender-responsive principles outlined in the Global Compact for Migration, the guide seeks to ensure that the implementation of the GCM contributes to advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, thereby helping to ensure that migration leads to a better life while enhancing livelihood opportunities, autonomy, and agency for all. To be practical as possible, the Policies and Practice Guide comprehensively addresses the linkages between gender and migration in all of its dimensions. For each of the 23 objectives of the GCM, the gender-specific issues have been identified and concrete measures on how to address them, both in policies and in practice, are provided. To make this as practical as possible, a concise, interactive checklist of actions is included for each of the objectives to enable policymakers to easily identify what steps are needed to be taken to ensure that migration policies are gender responsive. We hope that the Policies and Practice Guide serves as a trailblazer for future initiatives and continues to be a valuable resource for governments and other stakeholders around the world in their efforts to implement the GCM, but also in strengthening gender migration governance. I'd like to conclude by providing 3 concrete recommendations towards gender-responsive migration governance. First, on data. And this recommendation is to adopt a multi-sectoral approach and build national capacities for the collection, analysis, and dissemination of data on the experiences of women and girls at all stages of migration. The second recommendation is on strengthening laws, policies, and services to review and revise existing legislation and policies to expand options for regular migration that uphold the principles of equality and non-discrimination. And the third discrimination on participation, to empower and actively involve all migrants, in particular women and LGBTIQ+ people, to play a key role in strengthening migration governance so that it responds to their lived experience, realities, and priorities. This means amplifying women's voices and leadership. UN Women stands ready to work with member states and other key partners to advance human rights-based and gender-responsive migration governance that serves everyone, and in so doing, enhance livelihood opportunities, autonomy, and agency for women and girls towards the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Thanks very much to everyone for your attention.
Stevie, thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you for telling us a little bit more about the policy and practice guide. We'll make sure that when we circulate the policy brief after this event, we'll include the link to the policy guide so that people are able to access it and see it for themselves. And thanks also for highlighting the kind of human rights principles that should be underpinning any approach, including ensuring that migration governance is gender responsive. I think you'll hear in our next contribution from Felipe González Morales that this human rights framework, of course, which has come under challenge a lot over recent years in terms of the actual practice of migration governance, despite the kind of obligations on paper, that human rights framework is critical. And we know that human rights historically have been differentially applied in terms of the gendered nature of human rights abuses and their responses. So thank you, Simi. That's really a really useful start to our conversation. I am going to hand over now via the wonder of technology to a video message, as I say, from Felipe González Morales, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. Felipe has joined us previously on these roundtables to talk about, for example, issues of decent work. And he'll be familiar, I know, to many of you, a very strong advocate of the human rights of all migrants, and we're very interested to hear his thoughts on the issue of gender-responsive migration governance. So hopefully we'll hear that now.
Good morning. I thank the organizers of this roundtable on gender-responsive migration governance for the invitation. It is a pleasure for me as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants to make this short presentation. In fact, for my mandate, the situation of migrant women is of key importance, and I would like to start by calling the attention about the two reports presented a few years ago by the rapporteurship on the issue of gender and migration. One of them to the Human Rights Council and the other to the UN General Assembly. When we are about to reach the 5th anniversary of the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration, it is very important on the issue of governance of the situation of migrant women, the fact that the Global Compact for Migration is the first international instrument on migration which has a gender perspective. This, of course, should be the basis for states to move ahead in building an approach to migration which is gender responsive. In this regard, there are many issues that are relevant here, and measures could be and have been adopted by some states in this regard. First one of a general nature is the issue of ensuring equality and non-discrimination. In most countries, or at least in most democratic countries, there is a general prohibition of discrimination. However, many times this is only in the law, but it's not been really enforced. In this regard, it's completely necessary to ensure that there are specific provisions on the issue of gender discrimination. So this is not only a matter of general law, but of specific measures to be adopted by the state, and also ensuring that the civil society, especially organizations of women, can play a decisive role in this regard. In general, I would say that it's key to ensure that measures on the issue of migration are adequate to the need of migrant women. Over the last 10-15 years, there has been a feminization of migration. There are many women moving around the world nowadays, and this has come with a diversification of the women who migrate. In this regard, it's very important then to ensure that the state has a variety of answers to the situation of migrant women, and not apply simply a general rule or the same rule applied to everybody. Of course, this doesn't mean that paternalistic measures should take place. For instance, there are some countries which prohibit to migrate women from certain ages, which is completely against international law. It is very important to highlight that a number of countries have enacted measures to protect migrant women from gender violence, trafficking, and other crimes. In this regard, the state should take a decisive role. And this should include also the issue of issuing resident permits for migrant women in a series of circumstances, including the two that I just mentioned, those who are victims of trafficking and those who are victims of gender violence. For instance, it's very important to ensure that women who bring a case of gender violence is not going to be detained or expelled. Otherwise, you are promoting impunity. So it's very important to ensure that countries issue at least resident permits of a temporary nature in this regard. And sometimes they could also be permanent resident permits. It's also key to ensure the access to public services for women. And I would like to highlight the issue of access to health, including to sexual and reproductive rights. This is an issue at which we can see very diverse responses from states, and I see that there have been advances in many of them, but others not moving forward in a significant manner. It is important also to support the integration of migrant women in the countries of destination through a whole variety of measures, as well as to ensure that those migrant women who return to our countries of origin are also having the possibility of adequately reintegrating in their societies. Finally, I would like to stress the role of countries which are mostly of transit of migrants, which in the case of migrant women, they should ensure that they are not being left in a limbo, but that they are adequately protected in their human rights. And in many countries of transit, we observe that there are significant problems of violence in general and violence against women in particular, so the state should take special attention to this issue. Despite advances in many countries in recent years, key challenges persist. It's very significant, it's key to ensure that the joint efforts by UN agencies, states, and organizations from the civil society, particularly from women, are taken, and this would be crucial to ensure that we are moving forward to a gender-responsive migration governance. So thank you very much, and good luck during this event.
Thank you. I mean, again, highlighting the human rights context of gender responsive government, reminding us actually the GCM is nearly 5 years old, which I find a little shocking really, that those 5 years have passed. And of course, with a global pandemic in the interim that we know exacerbated and deepened inequalities of all kinds, including in relation to gender, and reminding us also of the importance of documentation and legal rights, because ultimately that provides the mechanism by which all these other rights can potentially be accessed. So I think that's a very important, again, set of things for us to think about as the broad context within which gender responsive migration governance occurs. So I'd like to hand over now and move to our panelists. As I said, I'm going to introduce them each in turn. I'm very much looking forward to their contribution and to some, I hope, concrete examples of both perhaps bad practice in terms of the consequences of a lack of gender responsive governance, but potentially also some good practices or some ideas about how we can shift from talking about the need for gender responsive governance to actually doing it, because that's the kind of policy practice gap that we need to address. So first of all, I'd like to welcome warmly our first speaker who joins us from Ghana. Mary, it's great to see you again. I hope we can see you if you want to put your camera on. Really nice to see you. Hi, Mary. So Mary Petrona Satrana is the director of the Center for Migration Studies at the University of Ghana and an associate professor of migration and social change at the Center for Migration Studies at the University of Ghana. She's also West Africa Chair of Forced Displacement, funded by the IDRC. Mary is a member of a huge range of different migration governance advisory groups and networks. One of the reasons, of course, why we were very interested to hear her perspectives on this topic. And she's also facilitated migration policy development in several African countries, including Botswana, Zambia, and Malawi, among others. Mary is also, I'm very happy to say, a researcher with the MIDEQ Hub and co-leads the Hub's research on gender and migration in the China-Ghana corridor. Welcome, Mary. We're very happy to see you. I'm looking forward to hearing your contribution. And you have 10 minutes. The screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heaven, and thank you and the organizers for inviting me to this discussion. That's very important, especially at this point in time in our history. So I would like to pick on two things, and the things that the various objectives that the roundtable is about. One, I want to talk about the importance of data and evidence that can support gender responsive migration, and also touch on the other part, which is strengthening capacity and foster partnerships for enhancing gender responsive migration governance. And I'll be doing this mainly from my own experience, and also working on the MIDEQ for all these number of years, and some of the impact work that we have been doing. And so the first point I want to raise is it important when we talk about data and evidence that can support gender responsive migration governance? Yes, data is good, but we don't need only quantitative data, which is usually emphasized by people who collect migration data. And so for us to understand the nuances and complexities in understanding the gendered issues, we need both the quantitative and the qualitative to do this. And thankfully, the MIDEQ project has been able to help us. We had several data collection. When I get there, I will talk about it. And so, first of all, we need disaggregated data. That is why data is important, but quality, good data, and sex disaggregated data is important. And that is what most of the time we lack. And so we need to collect and analyze data on migration with a gender-specific focus, which is also important for identifying the differences and the inequalities between migrant women workers. And so when we have the sex disaggregated data, what does it do? What's this important role? It helps us to understand the jobs, for instance, the jobs of migrant men and women, how they their access to job opportunities, which sectors they are, the working conditions of these people, and help us to understand the specific gender-related vulnerabilities. And so again, it also helps us to know the harmful gender stereotypes, such as labeling women as victims of migration. And it helps us to also have inclusive government policies and programs to optimize labor migration and migration in general and its governance. And so again, another benefit of having sex disaggregated data, it also helps us to quantify the economic and social contribution of both migrant women and men, which usually we focus not so much on the contribution. We only, most of the time, data is focusing on something else instead of also highlighting, especially the contribution of women. And so here, the MIDEQ project, which I have been involved, especially on the speaking from the gender work package, has done all these, and I mean, partly helped to resolve, or helping to resolve the problem is not totally resolved, but in the process, help us to resolve some of these problems. And so from using the MIDEQ project has given us rich qualitative and quantitative insights, deepening our understanding of the gender-specific needs and how policies and programs can be gender responsive in addressing these needs. And so I do this by using the case study that we had, the China-Ghana corridor, to explain some of these findings we have found. And so let me first say that I'm speaking from a context where there is male dominance. There's a lot of patriarchal values. And so you would hear me speak more for the women, but both men and women and all other groups are important. And so migration, I want to highlight 2 things or 3 things from the MIDEQ projects, especially for the gender work package. And so I highlight migration flows and decisions to migrate. And so here from the MIDEQ project, we have noticed the changing narratives. And so most of the time we talk about male dominance when it comes to China-Ghana corridor. Chinese coming to Ghana are usually males. We talk about Ghanaians going to China. There are males also doing all different kinds of things. But the MIDEQ project, where we interviewed 1,200 and over respondents with our over 100 qualitative, both Ghanaians and Chinese, have told us that yes, they are increasing female migration, both from China and from Ghana to China. And so there is the mixed flow, although we still acknowledge that the males are dominant in the sense. Again, the reasons for migration are economic for both men and women. So mainly economic reasons. People are migrating because they are finding better opportunities in Ghana, or they are finding better opportunities in China. And most of the Chinese, particularly who come to Ghana, find themselves in the mining sector, construction sector, the trade sector. And we find that they are highly educated and they find themselves in different fields. So that's the when it comes to migration flows and the decision making. But the second one I want to talk about is access to resources. And here it's about investment and remittances. But here I want to emphasize on investment. And I would like to highlight the use of networks for fronting businesses. And why are networks important? We also find that yes, people have their either previous migrants or other networks to help them. But from the MIDEQ data, we have found that the networks find it much more easier and comfortable when they are in a marital or sexual partnership relationship with Ghanaians or Chinese. So here we talk about Ghanaian being a relationship with Chinese, or Chinese being a relationship with Ghanaian. And so intermarriages between Chinese and Ghanaians have become key when it comes to fronting of businesses, setting up of businesses. So there are both benefits and challenges. Yes, there is employment creation. People are entering into sectors that ordinarily they couldn't have done so because the Chinese, there are rules and regulations. Ghanaians also have rules and regulations. But when there is intermarriage, these things overlap. And so these are some of the things we are finding. But there are also challenges, which I'll highlight later. And so the sectors, I've already mentioned the sectors, but we also find that there's unequal income. So here the Chinese, for instance, has money. We can have a Chinese woman who has money and can import from China, has the network to do that, and is likely to be in a relationship with a Ghanaian man who may not have the same amount of money to be able to import from Ghana to set up the business, the kind of business they have. But being in a relationship, they set up this family business which support each of them. But again, we also see differential educational statuses. So here, both the Chinese, Ghanaian don't usually have the same educational status. You either find the Chinese having a highly educated, and maybe the Ghanaian is medium or other round, or maybe the other way around also happens. And we also find the difference in terms of race, class, as also some of the factors influencing the kind of activities and the kind of inequalities that exist among them. And then the third one I want to talk about is migrant rights. And so here we also find from the MIDEQ data that social protection is weak for migrants, especially migrants working in rural sectors in Chinese companies. And again, some of the cases that we have reported from the MIDEQ study also shows that there is also tension when it comes to community, especially in those that are outskirts or rural areas. We find tension between Ghanaian male youth or migrant male youth and Chinese employers, because the agitation is that the Chinese employers have taken over their livelihoods. An example is what we call the galamsey, the small scale businesses. And so consistently, when people are engaged in small scale mining, where if Chinese take over, it brings tension between the locals and the migrants. So no means, again, talking to them, even where they are employed in Chinese companies, there are no means for both the migrants, males and females, to report their grievances. And so here males admitted that yes, they are sometimes victims of situations, abuses, but there are no means to report the poor working conditions. And there is also limited information on their rights. Do they even know their rights? How do they get employed? They will tell you they were there, they were called, they were asked to start job, not signing anything, not even verbal information. So they lack information also on the kind of or the nature of rights they themselves have to have in a foreign company. And then more men were paid also better. So even in that exploitative setting, men were paid better than women. And the men had a sort of somehow permanent position than the woman, although the men were doing much more riskier jobs compared to the women. And so you find that the men are going underground where the blasting takes place and where the mining activity, the gold is, but the women rather tie the explosives. All of them are dangerous and risky, but I mean, when you compare, you realize that theirs is much more riskier. And then language is also a problem. And because they cannot communicate well, so migrants, whether migrant from other neighboring countries or from other parts of the country to the rural community, they could not communicate with their Chinese employers. And so they adapted the language they called Chinese Ghanaian English language. They call it the go me go come. And so they had to develop their own way of communication, sometimes sign language, but that did not help them to explain themselves or maybe describe their grievances at the appropriate quarters. There was also no health insurance, no sick leave, no breaks, no holidays. Even lactating mothers had to go on maternity leave without any package. And we find that most of these women were casual workers also. And so looking at all these, the migrants, the MIDEQ project gives us something like if you are doing a gender analysis, we'll call it the gender impact assessment. So at least it helps us to know some of the challenges facing migrant women and migrant men, and facing even the local population who are in a relationship or in some context working relationship with the migrants. And so we ask ourselves, how do we strengthen capacity and foster partnerships for enhancing gender responsive migration, which will be my last part of the discussion. And so here, the MIDEQ study, as I've said, offers the gender impact pre-assessment. And so based on that, and the good thing is that MIDEQ gives us money for impact. And so we have a lot of impact activities, and I'm sharing with you some of the things we have done. So we had to gather the stakeholders. And so first of all, we chose the Ghana National Labor Migration Policy. And here we were looking at gender mainstreaming and which of the gender mainstreaming tools could help. And so we used the gender impact assessment. What we did was, first of all, to identify the gender gaps, develop evidence-based laws and policies so that we could address the needs we had identified and many more. And so here we needed to think about who do we invite to come. And then we thought of the whole of government and society approach. We needed to include both the bottom and the top level actors, CSOs, international partners, media, importantly, NGOs, and all other social partners. And so we had to do that invitation. But then we realized that when you send invitations out, when institutions are sending representatives, because it's gender, they send women. And so this time we were very specific in telling them that we wanted a 50-50. And so if there were two people come from an institution, we needed male, female. And we needed people who also understood the issues, or even if they didn't understand, but they had willingness to learn, they were invited. And so eventually we made sure that our meetings had 50-50 or 40 males, 60 females. And so together we had a workshop, we identified the needs, we went through the labor migration policy, and we asked them, using the recommendations from the UN Women on GCM, identify some of the issues that are not existing, you are not practicing in your institutions, and make some recommendations. And we realized that there were very much good recommendations that they made to us. And so at least we recommended to them that at least each institution should have gender focal points. So somebody who understands the gender issues, and not only women issues, but could also bring on board the different ideas that can help with the policy development. And so based on that, we had something we call maximizing policy impact through a gender lens. And here we started with the security personnel. Why did we do that? We noticed from our study that the security personnel, especially those at entry points, and those who were following up on migrants, didn't understand the gender issues. And so here we chose somebody from their midst to come and educate them on migrants' rights and gender-related issues, using practical examples of things that happened at the borders, at the entry and exit points, and some of the understanding they themselves thought they had. And so that was one of the first things we did. Again, the capacity training, we also had something on artistic performances. And so here we made them use local values to exhibit the way they understood these things. And so gender is not just about women, but I mean, all the categories that we need to think about. So we asked them, how would they be able to interpret using artistic methods and addressing the needs of the different people who come into their environment. And so we had that, and then we had something on theory of change, stakeholder analysis for themselves, for each institution to identify which stakeholders they think are appropriate when it comes to mainstreaming gender. Again, we have community debates. And so through the community debates, we felt it's important because these are communities that have tensions. And so what we did is that we hear the voices and sentiments of the most invisible, especially women who didn't want to voice out even when they were alone. And so we're able to bring them through the debate, through dances, performances, to tell us their own issues, problems, and how they thought they could have a harmonized relationship with the migrants. And so these are some of the things. But beyond that, how do we ensure that it's not just capacity building, but there is impact? What we did is, I call it to monitor the impact of such policies in order to ensure equitable effects. So what we have done is try to become core members of the National Commission for Migration. And so Ghana is launching the National Commission for Migration. CMS offers technical advice, and we also help them to mainstream some of mainstream gender issues into the migration policies in total. So I should say that from my experience with policy making, yes, they do have things on gender, but you find that it's skewed towards women who are trafficked. But we need to broaden that idea. We don't need to stay there as just that. And so that is why we organize some of these activities. And then again, one of the things we did also, being part of Labor Migration Working Group, we are part of the Labor Migration Working Group. What we did was to present to them the MIDEQ findings, a bit of which I have presented here. And then they have quarterly meetings. And so we made sure that in their activities, they report on which aspects they can do. Which gender specific aspects can they include? And so here, for instance, we had, for instance, the Labor Department that does recruitment agencies. Because of the findings, they then had to include regular visits, especially to the rural communities, to where foreign companies are, and explain to the workers how educate them on their rights, and also monitor the activities, because we realized that the monitoring and evaluation of their activities of foreign companies was not as frequent as it should be. And so this is something that every quarter we meet. We recently met and we ask, how many times have you done this? And then now they have been able to create database on recruitment agencies. They are gathering more data on some of the sensitization programs and where they have to be organized. And again, for instance, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is creating diaspora decks. This is something that was in the diaspora policy, the labor policy, that they need to have attaches. And so now the attaches have to be gender sensitive. They need to understand the gender responsive dimension we are talking about. And so we offer them training, but we hope to offer them even while they are outside, so that they'll be able to determine and offer some of their advice, for instance, pre-employment or pre-orientation before the migrant, even when on arrival, before and on arrival to wherever the migrant is. Again, the CMS through the Work Package 7 has an NGO we call the Migrant Advocacy Center. And so here, migrants are able to walk in, address their problems. Women, they listen to both the voices of men and women, and we help them to address them because we have partnership with stakeholders. So maybe to round up.
Oh, you're going to round up. That's great. Thank you.
That's round up. Exactly on point. So to round up, yes, we've been doing this with the help of the MIDEQ project, but there are some challenges. I mean, going forward, we have to look at sustainability when the MIDEQ project is over, and then government replacement of technocrats after some years. So you have to keep training the people over and over again because they are changing. And then also treating gender not as an afterthought, but right from the beginning when policies are being made. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for the very detailed evidence and data, because we talked about the importance of data from the MIDEQ project. Thanks also for saying or raising this issue of the framing, because one of the things we tend to do when we talk about gender issues, and particularly the experiences of migrant and refugee women, is we tend to highlight the things that go wrong, the positions that women find themselves in of exploitation, sexual violence, etc. And we kind of lose in that framing women's economic contribution, but also the other ways in which the migration process, the dynamics of it, the nuances of it, this issue of relationships, because it ultimately is relational. And thanks for the examples from that specific corridor, because we know that South-South migration is about 1/3 of all international migration. And if we're interested in understanding how migration can contribute towards development and delivery of the SDGs, we have to look at South-South migration, because that's potentially the biggest source of change and transformation. So those are really helpful examples, Mary. Thank you very much. We have a question just directed towards you, which is specifically about some of the work that you're referring to. I'm guessing we can refer people to the MIDEQ website, but if you've got any specific reports that you could send us the links to, then we can also include those in the chat. That would be very useful indeed. So thank you. We're going to move now to Asia, to Southeast Asia, and we are going to turn to our second panelist, who is Mina Pudel. Hi, Mina. I hope you can still hear us, and I hope you can put your camera on so we can see you. Excellent. Thank you, Mina. Yeah. Mina is a Nepali sociologist with a long and very committed history of development work, research, and feminist activism on issues affecting the lives of socially excluded and politically marginalized groups in Nepal, but also in other parts of the South, Southeast, and Central Asia, Western Europe, and North Africa, with various national and international organizations, including Oxfam GB, USAID, UN systems, and academia. Mina has very extensive policy research on various aspects of gender and migration in different areas: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and North Africa, specifically Libya. And she's written extensively on these issues, including an authored book on social rejection experienced by trafficked women in Nepal. Mina is also a very active member of MIDEQ's International Advisory Board. We're always very grateful for her input. And she's joining us from Kathmandu, which is already very late in the evening. So thank you, Mina, for making the time to join us. We're really grateful to have you with us. If you could limit your remarks to 10 minutes, that would be great, so that we can have some discussion afterwards. Yeah. The screen is yours, and I know you wish to share a PowerPoint. So
okay, thank you. Thank you, Evan.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Heaven. And this is great opportunity to share my experiences, and also the I think I will try to link with the MIDEQ work, but mostly I'm not using MIDEQ data at the moment, and using my own experiences of various countries, as you mentioned. And I will pick up strengthening legal mechanism, and of course it's linked with the policy things with the data as well. I'm very much interested to unpack that. How data system is working in Nepal, or whether there are data systems or not. So I will be focusing more on these areas. And I was very much impressed with Simi's work, that what she mentioned about the data system and migration governance is gender blind. Actually, yes, it is. Relatively, Nepal is a newcomer in the global market, so we are still gaining experiences of managing migration and also not managing migration properly, because we don't have integrated migration policy, and the country is being run by remittances sent by migrant, but we don't have migration policy. This is the situation. And of course, being a new labor supplier, so our migrants are low skill and more vulnerable than other migrants in South Asia. That tells us that the protection mechanism is very weak. And coming to women and men also from the marginalized community, they are the one actually the more vulnerable and facing a lot of challenges, as mostly dominated by the informal mechanism, informal channel to migrate, because they are not properly taken care by the current foreign employment policy. And of course, women are contributing a lot, but again, their contribution is not counted properly. So migration governance, that I don't need to repeat, this complex framework of national policies, mechanisms, and everything what we have, the linking with the regional mechanism, and of course, the global one. But the question is whether the complex mechanism is gender responsive or not. To me, it's not, because considered in the Nepal context that the key structural issue, I'm very much interested and I'm very much keen to unpack that structural issue that's shaping gender experiences, whether it's a migration or elsewhere, but here we are focusing on migration issue. The Nepali legal mechanism, the constitution, all the gender related mechanism, forget about migration now, just focus on gender issue here, the legal subordination to men, because Nepali women still, they need male guardian to get their national identity card, the citizenship and national identity card. So it's basically their identity, their agency is attached to man. That is the huge hurdle to get women's identity and to travel around and to get their decisions to migrate. And that actually creates the economic dependency to men, whether it's a family level or is a maternal family or husband's family or extended family, because largely women are totally dependent on man. So that's the situation. And then the cultural application and the toxic environment here in Nepal. I'm sorry to use that term, toxic, but this is very much the structural barrier that women are actually, their obligation is to preserve ijat, is honor. Because if women, for migrant women, if they cross the boundary of their family without permission from their male guardian, whether it's a father or husband or brother or in-laws, and then their agency identity is being questioned, because they need permission. First, they need legal permission. Second, they need the family decision to move. Otherwise, they will be seen as kind of bad women, whether it's working in migration, whether it's a working domestic migration, cross-border migration, or international migration. It doesn't matter. And then this situation, this legal, cultural, and economic vulnerability and all the dependency situation put women in lower position than men. This is kind of structural issue that we have been facing here. And the current legal system, though we have a new constitution, is much more a liberal constitution, liberal policies, economic policies, and other policies, but still these structural barriers are still remain. So, and I will try to unpack that, how these barriers are actually contributing to construct very much gender migration experiences for women on the move. And what is happening, and this is because of this situation. And to see that what is the numerical status of this current last several years, the recent report came out from the Labor Ministry on migration, national migration report. It shows that sorry, this slide is a little bit not very clear, that the orange color is women's number. So because of this structural issue, women are following informal route to migrate because of their citizenship, because of their the challenge to get family permission, and also the government system is that still women to migrate to certain countries in the Middle East are restricted because for the domestic work, because the government and the policy maker, they think that this is if we allow women to go without proper mechanism, proper process, then they will be at risk of trafficking and other forms of exploitation. But saying that means basically you are stopping women to take a formal route, you are stopping women to take a labor approval process, and you are stopping women to go through the proper mechanism, and pushing them to the hands of smuggler and traffickers. And that is what is happening. That's why here you see the formal migration, the number of women is very, very, very low. It doesn't mean that the women travelers are that low, that what data is showing, because most of the women who are not getting permission from their family, who are not getting approval from the government, they are following informal mechanism, informal channel, largely via India, because the Indo-Nepal border is open border. So the smugglers and traffickers, and also the migration, the foreign employment agent, they are taking women via India. And you know that South Asia, elsewhere also, South Asia is very much that you can buy all the travel document in the street. So this data is recent data came out. It shows that from the beginning 2008 to now, the number of women migrating using formal channels is very, very, very low. A Nepal commitment and gaps that I want to focus more. The international, yes, we are very good on signing most of the UN mechanism, and yes, we are very good on GCM and SDGs, and SDGs also adopted in the 15th National Planning document from the Federal Planning Commission, which is the powerful one. But when it comes to the implementation, then again, it's very much lip service. The implementation is the policy document is there, plan is there, but there is no mechanism to implement, and there is no commitment to implement, and there is no proper monitoring mechanism. So these policies are for politicians, policies are for donor, policies are for the bureaucrats, not for the people. But Nepal is not yet party to migrant worker and that UN convention. So this is key. And the regional mechanism, yes, we are good on all this Colombo process, Abu Dhabi process, SAC and everything. But again, the whole issue is that, yes, we have signed for the political purpose, not for the protection of the people on the move. A national mechanism, we have, as I mentioned, that we have Foreign Employment Act and subsequent directives. There are so many documents now. Every year they are producing so many documents, but they don't have integrated migration policy. The Foreign Employment Act is basically promoting people to move without having proper protection mechanism, without having proper bilateral mechanism to protect their rights in the workplace. Just send them out and expect more remittances. This is what the government attitude and their intention is all about. And this FEMIS, this foreign employment, here the data issue, foreign employment management information system, we do have very good, very comprehensive data system at the central level. But again, these data systems are only for the migrant who are traveling via international airport, getting labor approval from the ministry, not for the informal migrant using informal channel. And as I mentioned, mostly women and people from the very, very, very low income people, men and women both, from the remote area, from the southern part of the country, they are not being able to, women, there are a structural problem. For men also from the low income, their problem is the economic problem. They are not being able to get through all this heavily bureaucratic system, highly corrupted system. So they just better to take informal channel using smugglers and agent and get into trouble. And these FEMIS is not including those data. So how what is our estimation then? What is our how we see the size of the migration? So that's the problem. And we don't have proper policy to oversee. We don't have proper policy to ensure that people are traveling with safety and their workplace is much more workplace is ensured by protection mechanism. No, institutions are in place. Here again, my issue is that the integrated migration policy, what I'm advocating for, is that there are various ministries, various departments, various tribunal board, and all information centers are there. Information centers are actually up to the grassroots level, but the complaint mechanism is also there. But again, these are largely for the formal migrant, not for the informal mechanism. That means is they are not accessible to women. Very few women traveling using formal mechanism. They are the only, if they can, if they are supported by their family, if they are supported by NGOs, if they are supported by their migrant network, they get access to those things. So access to information, access to services, including health, all these migration related protection services are not accessible to those people in the need. And as I mentioned, federal level 15 national plan has actually incorporated GCM and SDGs, migration and gender related objective. But again, it's very centralized system. It's not trickled down to the federal, the provincial level, and not trickled down to the local level. So this is, although we have state institution is federalized, but policies are still central level. So as I said, the FEMS database does not cover Nepal-India migration. There's huge issue about Indo-Nepal migration, and a large amount of remittances coming, but migrant traveling to India, working in India, they are not counted as migrants. So they are nowhere in the policy system. They are nowhere in migration definition in this country. Same migrant coming from India, they are not counted here as a migrant. So this is situation. So this is, I don't know how to address this. It's open border, but this is something that nobody's talking, and particularly the policy makers, parliamentarians, and bureaucrats, they are not talking because they don't have answer. Because you have to negotiate with India, you have to sit with India and go to the diplomatic channel and get through. But I'm not sure they will be able to do, or they are whether they are interested to do this or not. Migrant taking informal channel, yes, I mentioned already. Skill occupations records are based on the demand later coming from the destination country, not the migrant, their skill and their desire, their skill they gain, and the job they are going to work. So this is what, these are examples I'm putting here, where data system is and what are the gaps in data system, and why data system is actually not representing whole migrant population. They are sending remittances and desire to migrate. Newly introduced social, this is recently introduced, newly introduced social security scheme criteria are highly gendered. They require citizenship. As I mentioned, the legal subordination and citizenship, how it works together. It doesn't work together. So you require citizenship, but you don't get citizenship if your male guardians are not, they are not happy, or they don't think you need that. And particularly the women migrant working in India, when they return, they are seen as a bad women. Their sexuality is being challenged, their identity is being challenged, because they are taking informal route. Many of them, they don't get into all this highly bureaucratic, highly patriarchal and feudal decision-making process at the family level. They just leave because they want to run away from the abusive relationship. They want to escape from the violence, domestic violence. They want to escape from the other forms of violence at family and community level. So they are not welcome back by their family. And if you are not welcome back, no way you will get citizenship card. And go to India, come back India, you don't need citizenship card. So this is situation. Work permit is not, is extremely difficult to get work permit for women. And the contract paper, informal mechanism, informal migration, no way you get, particularly the women working in the Middle East as domestic worker. They don't have contract paper. Forget about India, even the GCC countries, and employees details and all. These are requirement for the security scheme. But men, yes, if you want, you can. But for women, it's extremely difficult. So these criteria are impossible to meet by women migrated through trafficking, smuggling, and other informal mechanisms. So now on return, the last slide, structural barriers, stigmatization when they return, because if they don't follow formal mechanism, they are not in touch with the family when in workplace, when in the destination, and something, I mean, the difficult migration process they experience, and they are stigmatized, they are seen as bad women, and you are not being able to protect honor of the family. So sexualized identity, agency of women is being challenged, and the entrepreneurship, who gets support from the family, information on markets, and who gets support from the bank loan, matching fund, government matching fund, private matching fund, the labor market. Most of these institutions are highly masculine, and in Nepali context, labor market is also feudal. So in this way, we're talking about empowering women migrant and protecting rights of the women migrants. So this is where we are. So to me, to conclude that, we have been trying to push, and we have been trying to, through MIDEQ project and also through various projects, and we've been trying to engage with the policymaker to think about integrated migration policy. Bring, for example, the women migrant women. There is a women ministry, separate standalone women Ministry of Women, Children, whatever ministry is there. If something goes wrong with the female migrant, whether it's India, whether domestic migrant or Middle East, and there is the labor ministry who actually issue permits, they don't care. They send these women migrant to Ministry of Women. And Ministry of Women, what they say, that, okay, you are migrant, we don't care. We care only women in the country, so we don't care if you work abroad. So where these women will go? This is one example. There are several examples like, so if very much departmentalized approach. There is no integrated approach. There is no mechanism to sit together and think collectively and develop integrated comprehensive policy, bringing all the stakeholders together, the government stakeholder, embassies, and also the private labor market and the NGOs. So this is something that is a huge task ahead. So I'll stop here now, and if there are any questions, then I'm happy to respond. Thank you.
Nina, thank you. I think the way that you highlighted the structural issues, both in the context where women come from, but also, of course, the context where they move to, those structural issues around economic dependency, legal subordination, cultural obligation, and their kind of social position, you can't really understand the consequences of migration without looking at those things. And both you and Mary mentioned the P word, thank you for doing that, patriarchy, which of course is a really important structural explanation as to why women have the kind of experiences that they do. And I think it takes us away from just focusing on the outcomes of the migration and trying to understand why those outcomes take the form that they do, which is critically important. So thank you for highlighting that. I'm sure we'll come back in the Q&A and in the comments time to some of those points that you raised that were very important. A reminder to those of you online, if you have any comments or questions, please do put them in the Q&A box and we will endeavour to get to them before we finish. But thank you, Mina. I hope you can stay on for the questions if it's possible. I know, as I say, it's very late, but we really appreciate your input. So we'll move now to our final speaker who joins us from Canada, I think. Jenna Hennebury, welcome. It's great to have you with us. We're delighted you could join us. Jenna is a full professor at the Basile School of International Affairs, coordinator of the Women and Gender Studies program, and associate dean of the School of International Policy and Governance at Wilfrid Laurier University. She's a co-founder of the International Migration Research Centre and the Migration Worker Health Project, and founder of the Gender Plus Migration Hub, funded by Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. And I know, Jenna, you also work very closely with the UN Migration Network, with UN Women. You co-lead the gender work stream of the UN Migration Network with UN Women. So you're obviously very much embedded in some of these conversations that we're having about how we can improve gender responsiveness. And you have your own, of course, portfolio of research on these issues for a long time, working with those organizations. So Jenna, I think you're going to tell us a little bit more about the ways in which the Gender Plus Migration Hub is working with governments to ensure gender responsive migration governance. And we're really looking forward to hearing more. We're a bit short on time, so if you could keep your presentation to 10 minutes, that would be really appreciated, and then we can have some time for some discussion. So the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak. I thought I would reflect on a couple of things. First, the issue around data and evidence and how it can support gender responsive migration governance, but it's something I've talked about a lot before, so I don't want to repeat things, so I'm going to move that ahead a tiny bit. And then also how the GCM can contribute to the realization of SDGs, particularly Goal 5 on gender equality. I think because of short on time, I'm going to make 3 main points, and then I hope I get to them. And if we don't get to them, we can have a chat later. And I have a slideshow, so I'm going to put up the slideshow now and get started in talking about my main points as well. We need more diverse data, better data. And when I mean diverse data and better data, I don't mean just a bunch more counts of numbers of women on the move. I mean qualitative data and data that actually helps us measure gender equality throughout migration. We need to use these data to inform and modify policy to be responsive, but also transformative of gender realities of migration. And third, data and indicators are linked. So we need data and indicators of progress that are integrated, active, systemic, and calibrated around gender equality goals. That's the point of the presentation, so hopefully I'll get to those things. Only point about this slide is simply that the gender responsive guiding principle doesn't mean just counting women and noting when they happen and identifying policies that affect them. It also is about promoting gender equality. It's not just, as pointed out by Mary, about just being gender responsive when there's particular objectives that seem to be perceived to be more applicable to women and vulnerabilities, like 7 or 10 on reducing or eliminating trafficking. Gender responsiveness in the GCM actually pertains to every single objective, from objective 1 right through all the way down. And you can go through each objective. You can do that individually with resources that we have through the Gender Plus Migration Hub, but you can also do it through UN Women's Policy and Practices Guide and see how each one can be thought of in a way that is gender responsive. So data that we need in order to really think about making the GCM gender responsive needs to allow us to get the full picture of the realities of migration from a gendered perspective. It's not just about measures of sex disaggregated data, right? So men and women on the move and measuring where they're going. It's also about better measurement of how gender is impacting migration all the way along. So we have real gaps in our production and collection of data at international levels and at national levels that are giving us a really incomplete picture of the experiences of migration. We need more data on intersectional experiences of women and people with diverse gender identities, with disabilities, who are LGBTIQ+, that we understand how gender impacts migration truly when you're carrying multiple intersecting identities that can lead to inequality. We also need to address that across, we keep saying we want more data, yay, more data, but there's all sorts of inconsistencies in the types and frequencies of measurement across data sources. States measure everything differently. It's great. And often we're totally missing types of data as well. We're missing measurement on temporary migrants, and we are missing measurement and details about detainment. These are types of things that we're not getting information on and that are inconsistently being measured from one country to another. There's also a need for training and education about the importance of gender responsiveness in data and what that means. And there's also a need for transparency and accountability so that data can be used not just by governments but also by civil society to hold governments to account to ensure gender responsiveness is indeed happening. Okay, so I have a Canadian case. I'm not going to spend much time on it because we don't have a lot of time, but I will say that Canada's got this gender responsive framework. It's got a new approach to measuring gender in Stats Canada. It's got IRCC involved, our immigration department, and they are finding ways to better measure gender throughout migration, but there's still some really big gaps, but there's some really good examples to look at. In our Gender Plus Migration Hub, we have over 100 different gender responsive practices. We've highlighted the Canadian case there for you as well to go look at, should you be interested. So to get to being really gender responsive, it's not just about identifying and being gender specific, identifying where women and LGBTIQ migrants are, for example, and then trying to sort of patch or put a Band-Aid on a problem. It's actually about transforming the system to identify the structural causes of gender discrimination. And so that's the data we need. What data do we need to do that? And I think what's key is that when we think about the way in which data gets utilized, it's not just that it gets utilized at the beginning or at the end. It's that data should be throughout the policy cycle. In order to do gender responsiveness, we need to have data inform decisions at all stages of the policy cycle. We need to have that data informing how we might modify a policy. We also need to make sure that that data includes the perspectives of migrant women as well. And that involves research, right? Because data on itself is insufficient. You need data that's coupled with research to help you actually interpret it and figure out how to move it ahead. And then that data should be used to evaluate existing policies and formulate changes as well. But really, I've been thinking a lot lately about how we measure progress on gender responsiveness in the GCM implementation, because data and indicators are really linked. So you'll hear a lot of talk about, for example, with respect to the SDGs. Here I have this this graphic showing here, which is showing progress on goal 5, which is not looking so hot, let's be honest. But all of those the data that's being reported are reported because they're seen as indicators of whether or not we're meeting a certain bar. I started out with a title, which I forgot to mention, but it was up anyway, which was basically that I think we need to be thinking about where do we want the bar to be in terms of thinking about what gender responsiveness is. And we need to be raising that bar. In order to do that, we need indicators for that. There's a lot of talk right now at the global level, certainly through the Network on Migration. There's a number of working groups. One is focusing on developing indicators for progress on the implementation of the GCM. And there's a need for us to really push for ideas about how to make sure gender is included in that. And so what I have outlined here, and this is my this is my main last slide, actually, which is that we need to have integrative indicators that are built upon and across the globally agreed upon measures and frameworks. So not siloed ones. Been working with my colleague Paula Semen from the Women in Migration Network to really think about how existing indicators like SDG 5.1, 8.8.2, and others, such as the proportion of population subject to physical violence, psychological and sexual violence, so 16.1.3 from the SDGs, how it could be disaggregated by gender, migration status, and all sorts of other variables, and potentially linked with other types of data and indicators, right? We have, the GCM didn't just pop out of nowhere. It's built on all these international agreements. We have an international convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women that has in it also specific indicators around women migrants using general recommendation number 26, for example. We have ILO 189 on domestic migrant workers. We have 190 on violence. ICRMW, each of those has indicators in them for how to mark progress and how to actually evaluate when there have been an approach that has been human rights based and gender responsive. And we need to build on those. We also need to recognize that building on those means not only those. We need to look to civil society and think tanks. There's the Women's Empowerment Index, the Gender Inequality Index. Some of those are from UN agencies, but also those beyond UN agencies like Gender Hub, our Gender Hub partners, the Center for Gender Justice have a great index on gender migration. Women in Migration Network has been developing ways to have inputs from migrant organizations, because I think that's where we need to be looking to actually measure our progress and actually push the bar up. I am also saying that it needs to be active versus passive measures. So we need to be thinking about structural measures that enable change. So how are budgets being allocated? How are women and gender issues represented in the network? How are they being implemented across different regions? How were they implemented in the IMRF and in the upcoming IMRF? How are what mechanisms are being used, and how can we use data like administrative data from the UN system to take stock on the extent to which we're actually addressing gender in a serious way? So if we look, for example, to the Multi-Partner Trust Fund, there was only one project funded on gender last year, to my knowledge. I guess 2022, I think. I may have gapped a year in there. Then systemic level measurements are key. And this is something I know Heaven has talked about before, and so have I. We need data on things that are specific to migration and gender that are not pilots or one-offs, or we want to know when there's been system level change. And so how do we measure that? So specific, non-gendered specific migration pathways. Are there increased numbers of women migrating independently with permanent status, with access to sexual and reproductive health rights, for example, going beyond it? So I'll end by saying that in order to calibrate what we're trying to do, you know, we keep saying we need data, we keep saying we need to measure our progress, but we need to do so around gender equality goals. We need outcomes that are going well beyond the GCM, which misses sexual and reproductive health rights and misses LGBTIQ+ for the most part. And so, for example, we need to move beyond those things. We need to go beyond what's in the GCM to make sure that we're actually incorporating data that is about outcomes, merely instead of merely evaluating and tweaking policy. We don't want to measure from where the bar has been brought down to, but we want to bring data together to develop indicators that seek to raise the bar and push upwards towards a global agenda around gender equality. To do that, we absolutely need the voices of migrant women. These are some migrant women I work with in Canada. I wanted to end with them and their voices and highlight just how important it is to make sure their voices are making it into these discussions around data and indicators, because it's very difficult to do. In a country like Canada, we have a gender results framework, but these women's voices do not end up coming to the fore when we're designing policies that influence their migration experience. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that very comprehensive overview that unpacks this idea of just more data. I think just more data is not necessarily what we're after, but the kind of integrated and systemic data that you're talking about, and the data that comes from the perspectives and voices of those directly affected is critical. And I think by raising the context of Canada in a way which has been, if you like, very progressive on this issue and has been very supportive of it, if there are challenges there, and you've identified some of them, then that obviously means that for other contexts too, there are going to be equally challenges, potentially even more so. So that's very helpful. We've had a request for the slides. I hope you might be able to share them with us. We'd be very happy to circulate them to people after the event. So thank you for the thumbs up. We have limited time, but we have some time. We have a few questions that we've gathered up online. I don't know whether there's any questions in the room. We have one. So let's take that one first, I think from the UN Migration Network. I'm hoping that the audience can hear you, but speak up loudly and then the microphone should pick you up even if they can't see you, or you can move up here if you want to be on the screen, your choice. Okay. And introduce yourself first if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. So my name is Ana Benziharet Gonzalez. I'm the Associate Liaison and Policy Officer at the UN Network on Migration Secretariat here in New York. So thanks very much for this very rich presentations and discussions today. And as mentioned, the network established a work stream that has been working on concrete ways to achieve a gender responsive implementation of the GCM. And so the work stream is co-led by UN Women, the Gender Plus Migration Hub, and other UN entities and civil society organizations. And I just wanted to bring a little of the work that has been done already on this work stream. So we developed the GRIT, the Gender Responsiveness Integrated Training Tool, to inform the GCM implementation. And also in April this year, we launched the Anti-Discrimination and COVID-19 Advocacy Tool. And more recently in June, we completed a pilot GRIT in Addis Ababa, and this 2.5 days training was well received by government actors and other stakeholders in Ethiopia. The workstream is now looking at ways to amplify that work, at rolling out the training, the GRIT, but also at creating more synergies with the GCM implementation workshops developed by the network. One other important element that I wanted to mention today is that next year we'll have the second round of regional reviews of the GCM. And so of course, the workstream on gender will also look at ways to contribute to these regional reviews, and it will be important to identify the gaps that remain in achieving a gender responsive GCM implementation, and also equally important that the pledges are monitored, including on gender, so that they can inform those regional reviews. And also one last one maybe on the fund, which is also an important part of the network capacity building mechanism. So just wanted to know that the fund uses a gender marker to ensure that all the joint programs, both funded and in the pipeline, integrate gender equality and women's empowerment throughout the project cycle, and that all 20 joint programs funded by the MPTF integrate a gender perspective and adopt a gender responsive approach, noting that UN Women with other UN entities is implementing 6 of those joint programs. So that was all on for
That's really helpful, thank you. If you're able to send us any links or to the things that you mentioned, it would be very helpful, because we can include those in the policy brief and also circulate them to the participants. It's very helpful, thank you. So just a few questions here, which I'm going to direct initially at the speakers to whom they were directed by the people who asked the question, and then I'm going to come back to you all if you want to make some final remarks. So question first for Simi. Really great to have you still here, I think. Simi, are you with us still? If not,
yes, I am. Thanks.
Fantastic. That's great to have you. Thank you. So I have 2 questions for you. One was in relation to the study that you mentioned in Niger, and wanting to know a little bit more about who carried out the study and when it might be available and how people could access it. And the second question was a broader one, which was specifically targeted at UN Women, but does UN Women recognize the importance of qualitative research? Because we've heard a lot about that today. So if you'd like to just respond to those 2 questions, and then I'll come back with some others for other panelists.
Let me just try to turn on my camera. Yeah, here I am. So thank you very much for both questions. And on the first, I'm going to defer to my colleague, Michael, who is in the room with you, Heaven. And on the second, absolutely. And whenever I mentioned data, research, information in my presentation at the opening, I was certainly referring to both qualitative and quantitative information. In fact, and Michael can go more into it, all of the research that has been done to increase and improve the kind of data, evidence, and knowledge that we have about women and girls on the move and gender diverse people on the move is based on both quantitative and qualitative data sources and methodologies. And so, for example, the research I referenced from Niger, obviously many of the questions were to elicit qualitative information about the lived experiences of women migrating in through from Niger quite broadly. And in terms of the research that we have done in the past, again, and the policy briefs that we have prepared in the past, we've very much relied on qualitative information and data evidence and data and evidence that we believe is as, if not more, useful to inform policymaking and gender responsive migration governance and programs as qualitative information, as quantitative information. We understand the utility of quantitative information. We know that governments and policymakers use it all the time, but in order to make the kind of transformative change that we're interested in, we need better and improved and more qualitative information that reflects the voices and agency of migration of women migrants, women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Simi.
And now over to you, Michael.
Yeah, Michael, I was going to say over to you to answer the question on the Niger study, which would be great to be able to circulate the link for that as well.
Yes, for sure. And so the Niger study was conducted in partnership with a civil society organization. They work on data collection. I was trying to pull up very quickly the name, but I was not able to do it because technology is not our friend today. But we worked in partnership with them, and they carried out these studies in the 3 regions that we mentioned. It was predominantly qualitative information that was gathered as part of that study, so sort of reinforcing the importance of that was reiterated by Jenna as well. It's not just about counting numbers, because numbers don't always tell you everything that we need to know. And so the data that was collected in this study really was a deep dive into sharing their experiences. And so that study is being developed. A report is being developed from that study at the moment that will be launched very soon. It's going to be launched in English and French. And it's sharing some of the analysis from that research to get an understanding of what those experiences are at various stages of migration. And I think that's the important thing. It's not just looking at those people that are in countries of destination, but also women's experiences at all stages. And of course, we recognize that this is a very small snapshot. It's 1,200 women, but that is key. I think the importance of qualitative information is not always the quantity, but really the questions that are asked and the information that is shared. So once that report is launched, which should be, it will be before the end of the year, but we'll be sharing that report with Heaven, so that can also be circulated. And it does give us that, it starts to fill some of those gaps which are missing when we're just looking at numbers of women migrating.
Thank you, Michael. That's really helpful. We're very happy to share the links in due course and hopefully attend the launch as well. I'm very interested to hear the research. A couple more questions, and I'm going to direct these, they're directed at individuals, but actually they're quite broad. So I think Mary or Mina, you might want to come back on these questions. So first, it's a question directed at Mina, but others may want to comment around what really is the role of the UN, and specifically UN related or international banking, I guess, World Bank, IMF. You know, have they got a role to play in all of this? Because we talked about the need to go out with just migration policy in a way. So what role might other organizations and banks, in particular international banks, play in this process? That was one question. And the second question was really a question about internal labor migration policies and gender inequalities there. Obviously the GCM and other indicators are focused much more on international migration, but you were alluding also, Mina, in your presentation to, you know, the open border between Nepal and India, which makes it very difficult to, you know, even understand what's going on because there's so little information when you have an open border. So I'll leave it to you to interpret those questions as you wish, but Mina, perhaps come to you first and then Mary.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's very interesting and important question. First, the banking system. I think the whole issue here is that there are policies. The policies that they don't say discrimination between men and women, but the whole issue about the subsequent guidelines and subsequent directives are not there. And the second is that the attitude of the bureaucratic system, that the bureaucrat, they don't trust women. So I think it needs more internal advocacy and internal engagement with the advocacy human rights groups and policy maker. That is one. And the second is that, yes, the women who are not legally eligible to get loan and all this because of their ID card, that again link with the constitutional process that has to be addressed by the politician, because why they put discriminatory practices, discriminatory provisions in the constitution and subsequent policies. I think to me, it's a less role from international banking system or international agencies, but more role with the local advocacy groups to engage with the politician. That is one. Second is that the Indo-Nepal border, again, the whole issue of the diplomatic relationship with India, it has to be, because we have 1950s treaty that the colonial legacy that the treaty, friendship treaty, opened the border, which is great. People can move and here and there. But what are the challenges and vulnerabilities these open border systems are putting in place for the particularly people on the move, and not having proper monitoring mechanism and support system at the border? So I think that we have been, not we, but Nepal has been engaged with India to review 1950s treaty. I think that is again the engagement between two states and work out outdated treaties and make it contextual, considering the need for the migrant, and also the need for, and the whole issue about the right to mobility. So it's more macro issue, and the politicians should be responsible for that. Yes, of course, we can do advocacy from our level. Thanks.
Thank you, Mina. That's a very interesting example again. Mary, any thoughts on some of those questions that were presented?
Yes, I want to comment on the internal migration. The question that says gender inequalities in internal labor migration policy. So I think, as Heaven, you already said, the labor migration policies, I mean, from my experience, they all target international migration. And I think per the ILO also guidelines, they also focus on that. But internal migration is also important, but it's captured usually as nationals. So depending on which level of internal you are referring to, if you are referring to people moving from one part of the country to the other, then it's captured within the labor laws of the country. But then for if you take ECOWAS, for instance, and some other parts of Africa, cross-border trading is important, but usually they are not easily captured. And again, we have other workers which are moving, other workers moving from one country to the other. These are things we need to pay attention to. They only come up in the policies when we are talking about border challenges, and not necessarily how to formalize, ensure that although they are in the informal sector, they also have access to protection and other benefits that labor migrants are entitled to. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. I think that comes back to Jenna's point about the need to look at systemic indicators, because there's ultimately, in almost all countries, almost all, not all, but many countries have far more internal migration than international migration, as we know. So, I say almost all because, of course, the countries of the Gulf states, for example, have much more external migration inwards, but in the majority of cases, much migration is internal. So if we don't also consider that, then we're entirely missing a whole sector of structural issues that can seriously undermine the delivery of SDG 5 in particular. So thank you, Mary, that's very helpful. I'm going to ask a very broad question because I'm very interested in each of you perhaps giving us one idea, one core idea that you think would make a difference. And I'm going to come to you, Jenna, first. And I realize it's a very unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I think one of the things that strikes me, and as I say, I've been working on these issues since the late 1980s. One of the things that strikes me is that there is a lot now in terms of kind of recognitions of the importance of gender sensitivity, responsiveness, data collection. It's great that within the GCM we have that recognition of the importance of these issues, the kind of mainstreaming of gender. But there still, to me, seems to be a very significant gap between what is kind of on paper and what is happening in practice. Which is not to say that it's not important to have those things in paper, but what I wanted to ask you each unfairly, I suspect, is what is the one thing that you think, with the exception of the end of patriarchy, what is the one thing that would potentially shift us from this policy practice gap? What should and could be the priority for whichever constituency you think is the most important, I guess, but, you know, I'm putting you on the spot really, to say, how do we move on beyond having things on paper towards actually making a difference to people on the ground, and specifically those groups who are marginalized from a gender perspective? Jenna, unfair question to you first.
Well, I mean, I can provide an equally shifty kind of answer, but, you know, I mean, I think we need a mechanism that better facilitates the voices of migrants themselves into this discussion. You know, it's often the same actors. We often get UN agencies and international organizations. You get governments. You get some very sensitized to the issues, and then you get academics, and then you get civil society that's getting closer. But, you know, at the IMRF, there were, you know, a handful of women migrants that were brought there by other civil society actors that really, really helped to bring them there. Their impact, their voices absolutely changed the tenor in the room. And I think that more of those voices and a mechanism to enable them, right? So there needs to be money to that. There needs to be resources to enable that, and ways to do that at local levels and at regional levels. You know, we have the regional reviews; they're helpful in this process, but I don't think they're doing enough. So if I had one thing, it would be more women migrants' voices in the mix, in the pot.
That's a great point, and my experience at the IMF was very similar. Those sessions that were inclusive of those voices were very different and very much more nuanced in terms of the narratives and the framing and the solutions of the issues. So great point, thank you. Mary, I'm going to come to you next with my unfair question and see if you have something which you think would make a difference.
Yeah, so what I think would make a difference is political will. And so most of our governments, from where I sit, from coming from working with other African countries, yes, we sign on and ratify all the conventions, but the will to implement. So I'm asking myself, what do we need to do again for them to go beyond just signing and having the will to implement? And that's also linked to other factors like resources, having the capacity, knowing the importance of including all these. So I mean, I will urge for inclusiveness, but then that can happen if there's a political will, not only on paper, but practicalizing and making sure that we achieve what we say. I think that would help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And a shameless plug here for forthcoming UN-UCPR research with OECD, specifically on how to mobilize political will, actually in context of forced displacement, but really unpacking the concept of political will and saying how we can mobilize it for these kinds of objectives. So thank you for that point, Mary, really important. Nina, same question to you. At an ungodly hour in Kathmandu, what do you think would make the difference?
I agree with Jenna and Mary. Then also I want to add one more, that acknowledging those contributions, that also when we talk about the researches, I see, at least from my perspective here, where I'm working now, is the researches as in one side and one table, and the policymakers on the other table. I don't see the proper engagement. The academics and researchers, we do research, but whether we are able to push those resources into system or not, that is one. And also that there is no option. I see that there is an option engaging with the politician, because they are good on raising resources, they are good on raising all these slogans, but they don't know how to implement. First, they don't know. Second, even they know, they don't want to implement. So how to make them work? one option could, my experience recently, what we did in Kathmandu recently in one of the program, that where trade unions are now, because trade unions are not raising their voices for the migrant. They are raising their voices for their own little boxes around, and they're affiliated with their political ideology. But how we bring that trade union and migrant themselves together and make the strong advocacy group, I think that is one. And also the engagement with policymakers, there is no option. We don't, I mean, we shouldn't be getting tired just to engage and engage and engage.
Thank you, Mina. I mean, we've heard talk of evidence-based policy making for 2 decades now, I guess, but as you say, the translation of that into practice can be very challenging. There's plenty of research. We know what the issues are often, but actually making that translate into policy change can be another story altogether. So thank you for those. Simi, I'll come to you last but not least, if I may. From the perspective of UN Women, what do you think would really help here in terms of shifting the way that this is done?
Thanks so much, Heaven, and thanks to Jenna, Mary, and Mina for their great suggestions, which I can only build on. I think from UN Women's perspective, in order to really make migration governance gender responsive at all levels, what we need is mobilization of migrant women's organizations, supporting them to come together, supporting them to mobilize, supporting them to get the resources they need to do their advocacy and policy changing work. If we don't have well-resourced, well-informed migrant women's organizations that are connected to labor organizations, labor unions, domestic workers organizations, other civil society organizations at the grassroots level, we're not going to get very far. And so we think this is essential. And of course, we want to make sure that the laws and the policies and the resourcing changes, but we need those stalwart allies in the form of migrant women and girls themselves to be politically active, socially active, and give us the leadership we need to make the changes that they need. So I would say that. I hope I haven't gone on too long, and I hope that there's another minute left so that Michael can also come in as our gender and migration expert in New York.
Thank you, Simi. And Michael, you've been put on the spot with a different question. I'm sorry, it wasn't me. So anything you'd like to add in terms of...
I mean, I can't really follow that, and I think that the contributions have really underlined some of these critical issues. The one addition I would make is the importance of narratives as well. And I think this builds on the points that have been made, and sort of the importance of active involvement and participation of migrant women and their organizations to tell their stories and share their experiences. So we're not just, so this is not a top-down policy-making process, but rather building up from those people that are experiencing these policies, these laws, and this discrimination as well. And in particular, I think exploring what we mean when we're talking about the gender and migration. I think Mary made the point that when people hear the word gender, they equate that with women. And I think that misnomer has led to many of the problems we're facing. Gender affects every single one of us. But the reality is that gender inequalities affect women and gender diverse people much more than it affects men because of patriarchy, because of gender inequalities. So I think really changing the way we're talking about gender responsiveness, gender and migration, and building those narratives so that they reflect a fair reality of these experiences and building policies out of that.
Excellent points to conclude on. Thank you very much indeed. Listen, it's been a really excellent roundtable. I really love these roundtables because we get really into some detail in a way that's sometimes not possible, certainly here in New York. So really grateful to all of our speakers. I'm sure you'll agree they were really excellent. I'm going to give them a sign of appreciation. Thank you very much for joining us and for your really in-depth insights into the ways in which we can make gender governance more migration governance more gender responsive. Thanks to the team here in New York for all your work in making this possible, particularly to Jack Durrell, to Fabiana Kuchia, and to Tess Pilkington. Sorry for the technical stuff, but we got through it. And thanks to you for all your engagement and contributions, both online and in the room. As mentioned earlier, we'll be producing a policy brief summarizing some of the key themes and recommendations. We'll try and add in all the presentations where we can and any links that you want to send us to be circulated, and we'll get that to you as soon as we can. And we have these migration policy roundtables now around every 3 months, 2 to 3 months. Always a good opportunity to have a more in-depth discussion, and really hope to see you at future ones. So you're now on our mailing list. You will get sent stuff, and hope to see you again. Thank you.